And we're back in the car on a freezing Monday night like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this Monday evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So I'm actually going to turn this light off. It's a little bit too harsh and too bright. Now we'll get a little bit of a film noir feel. Maybe I'll start puffing on a cigarette because I'm trying to quit, even though I've never smoked. Think about how many times in movies like that people smoke. They're trying to quit. They did quit. Now they're going to start smoking again because events of the story push them in that direction. But it is now 35 years plus one day since the release of a film which was a box office disaster and a major hit upon its star, producer, and director. And under normal circumstances, this would have signaled the end of this particular, already an iconic figure in Hollywood. This was the end of his time on a so-called A-list. This was the end of his time as a leading man, as a major player from every possible angle. And he was never going to win an Oscar. He didn't really make those kinds of movies. He's on the action heroes Mount Rushmore. And his old buddy Arnold Schwarzenegger argued that even today, if you're doing an action heroes Mount Rushmore, this man gets a slot. Because a lot of the stuff that later action stars, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger, such as Stallone and Bruce Willis and Mel Gibson and Kurt Russell and Wesley Snipes, this guy did it first, and dare I say, he did it better than anyone except maybe Harrison Ford and Tom Cruise. But on December 7th, 1990, Clint Eastwood's The Rookie opened in theaters. Now, to kind of give you a little bit of the mindset of somebody such as myself and to sort of put you in the position of what it was like, because I don't want to just give you a date and then just start throwing, trivia or whatever it is at you, but to understand that 1990 was a very good year for movies. In fact, on the same day that The Rookie was released, another brand name movie opened, one which is a lot better remembered by history, Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands. Now, Misery had opened the previous week in 1990, but number one at the box office the week of December 7th, December 8th, December 9th, 1990 was, not surprisingly, Home Alone. So The Rookie was the kind of death knell. It ended up being the last film, if you want to call it the first iteration of the the producer, actor, director who I'm referencing. If you're this far into this episode, you already know I'm talking about Clint Eastwood. So Clint Eastwood, from when he first became a movie star, which was almost accidental, he did a film, he went to Italy to make a movie with Sergio Leone called The Magnificent Stranger, which he realized was kind of a remake of the Kurosawa film Yojimbo. But The Magnificent Stranger did not get released in the United States when Clint Eastwood thought it was going to get released. And he said, I guess, it seemed like Sergio and me were making a great movie, but it's so bad that they didn't give it a distribution in the United States. In the early to mid 1960s, information traveled very slowly. Nowadays, he would have known exactly what was going on with the film 5 minutes before. So he thought, this film's a disaster. I guess my movie career is over before it started. It's never coming out. But it turned out it had already been released unbeknownst to Clint Eastwood. Think about how crazy that is. And it was tearing up the box office. Except it was not called The Magnificent Stranger. It was called A Fistful of Dollars. And so Clint dovetailed from the success of A Fistful of Dollars. And then he made another movie in the so-called Dollars trilogy for a few dollars more, which was an even bigger success. And he did other films. He did a movie, The Witches, in Italy. And there's a famous picture of Clint Eastwood riding on a scooter in the mid-1960s, looking a lot like his son Scott, if I might add, or you might say that Scott looks a lot like his dad, Clint. And then Clint did the third and final film in the Dollars trilogy, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which, it's a top 5, maybe even a top 3 greatest Western ever made. So the success of the apparent disaster of The Magnificent Stranger, retitled A Fistful of Dollars, moved Clint Eastwood into his leading man movie star phase. And it's not as if every film he made after, let's just say, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was a smashing success, but he had a lot more successes than failures, and he didn't just take conventional, action-oriented, leading man kind of roles. He had a lot of those, but he balanced them with different kinds of films, different kinds of westerns like Joe Kidd, which was not entirely successful, but then he did Where Eagles Dare with Richard Burton. He did Two Mules for Sister Sarah with Shirley MacLaine. And he just showed, and of course, The Beguiled with his buddy and future running buddy and frequent collaborator, Don Siegel. So Clint Eastwood was the biggest movie star in Hollywood, and he was world's box office star #1 for many years. And even when he had films where the box office dipped, there would be a Dirty Harry, there would be a Play Misty for Me, a Magnum Force, a Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. There would be another film right behind it to keep him on the upper echelon or in the upper echelon. And he showed aptitude as a filmmaker and as a producer. And he was not surprisingly very hands-on, because most of the films, if not all in this era, that he produced, he also either starred in and or directed. His production company was called Malpaso. And to this day, he still has an office on the Warner Brothers lot. That's why when we talked about the merger the other day, you got to bring up Clint, because Clint has worked for Warner Brothers since the 1960s. Like, this is Mr. Warner Brothers. It's not Jack Warner and Harry Warner. But when you think about who was like the biggest moneymaker for Warner Brothers film operation since the 60s, the answer is Clint Eastwood, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. So he kept making terrific films, but he didn't get Oscar glory. There were certain movies in the 70s and 80s, and you can go back, and there are people that would argue he should have gotten a Best Actor nomination for Dirty Harry because he's phenomenal. And from the action hero Mount Rushmore, if you will, his doing that stunt where he jumps off of a trestle onto a school bus, that was not done. He was told he was not allowed to do it. You can't, over our dead body, do this stunt, Clint. You can't do this. You could die. And Clint, channeling Tom Cruise 37 years later in Tropic Thunder, he looked at Warner Brothers executives in the eyes and said, "Go fuck yourselves. Go fuck yourselves." Did the stunt anyway. Somebody had to take those risks. And Clint, he's 95. He doesn't look like when we think of a risk taker, but he was a risk taker. He was a trailblazer. And in Heartbreak Ridge, he was a life taker and a heartbreaker. But Clint Eastwood was still on top of the mountain as the 70s rolled into the 80s. Again, doing interesting films like Escape from Alcatraz, which, next to Shawshank Redemption, spoiler alert, that's the best prison break movie ever made, aside from Shawshank. I put it above Papillon or, not The Great Escape. That's a different kind of film. That's a prisoner of war type of movie. But Clint kept churning out box office hits, even films where you look back on, you say, I don't even understand what they were trying to do here. City Heat with Burt Reynolds, his pal, that's really not very good. Bronco Billy was a hit. It's just okay. He kept making Dirty Harry films. The Sudden Impact in 1983, Go Ahead, Make My Day, was an enormous box office hit. And Go Ahead, Make My Day became part of the public consciousness. Think about this. 1985, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, a former actor who made a lot of movies for Warner Brothers, right? Ronald Reagan was having an issue. Congress was fucking with him. Or maybe he was fucking with Congress. I don't remember. But there was an idea that they were going to try to override his veto. And Ronald Reagan actually told Congress, go ahead, make my day. It's funnier because Reagan was an actor. As Doc Brown says in Back to the Future, who's president of the United States? Marty McFly asks in 1985, and Marty has to say, Ronald Reagan. And Doc goes, Ronald Reagan, the actor? Yes, Ronald Reagan, the actor. But right up on through 1986's aforementioned Heartbreak Ridge, which was an enormous box office hit. Clint was 55 already when that movie was shot. He had been a major star already for more than 2 decades. But that film was an enormous box office hit. That was the only movie he made while serving as mayor of Carmel, California. His adopted hometown recently was in the news, and somebody should have asked Clint for his thoughts. They've banned pickleball in Carmel, California, because it makes a lot of noise. I mean, yeah, okay, but they banned it. You're not allowed to play pickleball in the town of Carmel. The problem when you have almost every resident is got the do-re-mi, you're going to have this kind of shit where other people aren't allowed to do normal activities because you have the complaining. And that's kind of why Clint Eastwood ran for mayor in the first place, because there were these stupid ordinances such as women can only wear heels as high as 1.5 to 2 inches, or else, I don't think anybody ever got arrested for that, but you can only wear heels up to 2 inches, and you could not sell ice cream within the city limits of Carmel, California, because ice cream is messy and it might get on the streets and then it costs money to clean up. That is a real thing. That is an ordinance that Clint Eastwood, on his first day as mayor, he figured out how to get rid of it. A nonpartisan mayor. Clint Eastwood did not run as a Democrat or Republican. He ran as a common sense citizen, and let's get rid of some of this stupid shit that City Hall has bestowed upon us, or thrown at us, or whatever phrase you want to use. But after Heartbreak Ridge, Clint Eastwood's career dipped for the first time. And it wasn't, well, he had one disaster at the box office, or this didn't do that well, but then he bounced right back. No. He did some TV with Steven Spielberg. There was a somewhat successful TV, kind of an ongoing series called Amazing Stories, where Clint and Steven, worked together, each directed an episode of the TV show. And then Clint had what should have been a surefire box office hit, the fifth and final Dirty Harry film, The Deadpool, which I will say is the second best out of the 5. Dirty Harry, the original, is really good. The sequel, Magnum Force, from a political standpoint, is arguably the most fascinating in the series, because we know that Harry Callahan's not above using lethal force, but you've got a gang of cops in the San Francisco Police Department that are just executing suspected criminals. I'm sorry, that's a bridge too far even for Harry Callahan, or as he says, where do you guys draw the line? Shooting's okay as long as the right people got shot, but where do you draw the line? Let's say that a neighbor's dog pisses on your lawn. Are you going to then decide to execute him? I feel like you guys might. And then it goes from there. The third film, The Enforcer with Tyne Daly, that's the weakest film in the series. Sudden Impact, not that great, but it has Go Ahead, Make My Day. So why don't you boys go suck some fish heads? He's got some great one-liners in that film, and that film is pretty rough. His former partner, Sandra Locke, plays basically a serial killer, but she's also only killing bad people. A little bit of a Dexter angle, if you will. But The Deadpool should have been a hit. It was a different approach to Dirty Harry. It's shot almost like a film noir, a little bit like the original Don Siegel. There are moments where it feels almost like a noir mystery, because it is a bit of a Zodiac killer. It was inspired by the Zodiac killer, so it has that element in the film. But The Deadpool also has 3 fantastic performers, 2 of whom would become huge stars, in the supporting cast. He has Patricia Clarkson, who I'm pretty sure was an Oscar nominee, and she's a fantastic actress. She was with Katie Holmes in Pieces of April, a really good movie from a couple of decades ago. And she plays Herb Brooks' wife, Kurt Russell, in the world of the movie Miracle. And she takes what should be a thankless role and makes it memorable, because she's so grounded and so amazing. So Patricia Clarkson in The Deadpool, and in big supporting roles, you have James Eugene Carey as an Axl Rose-style rocker who's on the verge of overdosing, and playing a horror film schlock filmmaker named Peter Swan is none other than Liam Neeson. So with all that, and the fact that the film is terrific and it has some really inventive action sequences and some real cool shit with like a little miniature car that works as an explosive, really great stuff, film didn't do that well at the box office. And Clint then directed but did not star in a film about the famous jazz musician Charlie Parker called Bird. And he managed to get, and there is a long list, but he got an amazing performance out of Forrest Whitaker. And Clint won an award at Cannes, I'm pretty sure, for that. And there was a lot of Oscar buzz around him and also Forrest Whitaker. But the film just didn't make any imprint in the U.S. box office, even though critics like Roger Ebert, even Rex Reed, who had never really been a fan of Clint, there were many major critics that said, this is one of the best films of the year. You know, that was the year of Rain Man and, of course, Mississippi Burning and The Accidental Tourist. 88 was a really strong year for movies, in my opinion. So with the failure of The Deadpool, Clint tried to go back to the action comedy realm, 2 of his biggest hits in the 70s into 1980, the Any Which Way But Loose movies, Right Turn, Clyde. And we found that Clint could be funny in the Any Which Way But Loose movies. He was the strong, silent type, but he allowed himself to look silly, and he seemed to revel in it, and there was a little bit of self-deprecation that sold it. that he wasn't taking himself so seriously. And this is something that Arnold Schwarzenegger has also talked about, how he, as a much bigger physical type of a guy, he needed to always poke fun at himself to let people know, even when you look like me, you're not immune from criticism, and you're also not immune from letting yourself look stupid in the service of a story. So Clint went back to action comedy, and another movie that should have worked, Pink Cadillac with Bernadette Peters. But that film conceptually just it was not smart from the jump, because you had this story of a young woman, a young wife who was estranged from her husband, played by the always amazing Bernadette Peters. Talk about a home run hitter of a talent, an incredible singer and a terrific actress. She plays a woman who gets involved with this counterfeiting ring, which is okay. She's inadvertently spending thousands in counterfeit money, and she's already on the run. And Clint, as a kind of bounty hunter, in a manner of, Bobby D in Midnight Run, he finds her, but realizes if he brings her in, she might spend 30 years in prison, and she knew nothing of what was going on. So that film should have been a success, but the bad guys are white supremacists. Why would you do that? Why would you not have the bad guys? You could have them be something else, anything but that. Why? And even Roger Ebert said, I wanted to like this movie, but you've got these, what are you doing here? You don't need that, not this film. This is supposed to be like family friendly. What the fuck are we doing here? So that film bombed. And then in 1990, Clint had two movies, one of which is the film that celebrated its 35th anniversary yesterday, The Rookie, but the other one was a prestige picture, which was supposed to get Clint Oscar buzz, in White Hunter Blackheart, an adaptation of a book by Peter Vertel about a true story of the legendary filmmaker John Huston. Speaking of Stallone, he directed one of my three favorite Stallone films, Victory, earlier in the 80s. But while John Huston was on location to shoot The African Queen with Katharine Hepburn and the Humphrey Bogart, he became so obsessed with the idea of going on a safari and killing an elephant, he almost didn't make the movie. That's so stupid. You say to yourself, well, that couldn't have happened, but yeah, it kind of did. It kind of did. So Clint made White Hunter Blackheart. There were many critics, also, again, including Rex Reed and Roger Ebert, who said, this film is phenomenal. This is for sure an Oscar contender, but it came out and it died at the box office. Eastwood suddenly was not guaranteed box office, because you can look at films in the 70s and into the 80s that really weren't that great, and they still turned a profit, such as The Eiger Sanction, which I really like, and a lot of critics did, such as The Gauntlet, such as Firefox, which is a really weird science fiction film in the early 80s. But now the name above the titles was not guaranteeing anything. And on December 7, 1990, The Rookie came out and landed with a thud at the box office, and it did not do well with critics. You go on Rotten Tomatoes right now, the film is in the 30s, and that is about as low as any Clint Eastwood film, certainly any one that he directed. A lot of the movies in his, kind of later era, 80s, 90s, and we've seen it. We know this. You look at, for example, Gran Torino in 2008. So The Rookie, I remember when it was coming out, and I had high hopes that it was going to be a really good action thriller, because the trailer, the previews looked pretty good. There was you could see some big budget spectacles, shit blowing up real good, almost like a la 1980s, but Hollywood still did that into the 90s. And when I opened the newspaper, the Newsday that we got at home, the day it opened, and Newsday gave it 1 star, I was crushed. I was 16 years old, and I had nothing good in my life except for the fact that I was bowling, and I ended up bowling in the state finals. But other than that, I was failing almost every class. It was all negative, and I couldn't even look forward to a good Clint Eastwood film. This film is a fucking stink bomb. But I remember watching Clint on with, well, it should have been Johnny Carson, but Carson had been away or something, and Jay Leno, a very young 35 year ago, Jay Leno was hosting, and Jay had gone to an advanced screening of The Rookie. And I think Jay was full of shit, but he said he really enjoyed the movie. He thought the stunt work was terrific, and the interplay between Clint Eastwood and his, at the time, still very young co-star in Charlie Sheen, he said he really enjoyed the movie. But Clint already, even at age 60, as he was here, when they talked about the movie Play Misty for Me, which Jay Leno said, no offense to anybody, but this is maybe my favorite movie that you made. as filmmaker. I know a lot of people outlaw Josie Wales, and that gets a hand. He's going over some of the films he said, but I think Play Misty for me is amazing. And, Fatal Attraction a few years before 1990 was similar, and I love that movie. And Leno said, one thing my wife appreciates, I don't know if he said wife, his wife Mavis, but he liked the fact that in many of his movies, there are strong female roles. And Clint talked about that, and he said, even in Play Misty for me, Jessica Walter, who was later on Arrested Development, he said, she's so good. And Clint said, Jay Leno, she was scary. And then they had a little bit of a joke where he said, we're talking about, strong female roles, but, spoiler alert, at the end of that, you kind of throw her through the window. And then Leno says, well, you could have a strong female role, but, and Jay says, yeah, if somebody deserves to get thrown through the window, you throw them through the window. I don't think they would have that conversation in 2025. But The Rookie grossed only 21 million worldwide. Like, this is not a perfect world a couple of years later where that film didn't do well in the United States, but just cleaned up overseas. And it's not like some of the Stallone films. I mean, I joke about it, but it's a real thing that in Europe, they line up around the block for Stallone in the 80s and 90s, and Sly had a lot of movies that didn't do that well in the States, but crushed it overseas. And The Rookie, for whatever reason, it just didn't connect with audiences either here in the States or in Europe, because Clint seemed to have a big following, but nobody came out to see The Rookie. So, bombed at the box office, bombed with critics, and the reality is that people in Hollywood were saying, this is probably it. I mean, Clint will always be able to work. This is things that would have been reported in the Hollywood Reporter, in Daily Variety, in regular gossip columns, whether it would be Liz Smith or Cindy Adams just kind of dipping their feet into the movie business as Cindy Adams, and especially Liz Smith, loved movies. She was always going to screenings and almost acting like a movie critic in certain ways. But the idea was Clint will still work, even with all of these disappointments one after another, with arguably, Bird, many people consider a masterpiece. It just, nobody saw it. It didn't even gross back its production cost, and it was not a big budget. So the idea that Clint would always be able to work, if he just wants to work as a filmmaker and, the budget is within certain parameters, Warner Brothers is going to keep funding him, because Clint Eastwood, every movie that he ever produced under the banner and the imprimatur, not only of Warner Brothers, but of Malpaso Productions, he brought in every film on time and under budget. Even Cry Macho with COVID, nobody got sick. They followed the protocols. Clint didn't say a word about it. They got that film still on time and under budget. Juror number 2, on time and under budget. Going all the way back to the late 60s, every single film was brought in on time and under budget. So he was always going to work. But the thing that most people, and I didn't know any of this shit, there was no internet back then. It was the early days. They were starting to talk about it, and we might be able to connect via computer and talk to people. None of this made any impression on me. But what people didn't know is that Clint Eastwood had a screenplay after the failure of The Rookie, and it looked like, man, he's fucked. And I should also point out, this was a critical time, December 1990, for Tom Hanks, because he had Bonfire of the Vanities, and that was a film that had enormous Oscar buzz because it was a prestige project. Tom Wolfe's best-selling novel, The Bonfire of the Vanities, is one of the great works of fiction of the second half of the 20th century. That is a hill I'll go down on. That is an extraordinary work. It's a satire, but it hits life in New York City circa mid-80s into like the 90s. It hits it so perfectly, and no one is spared. Every socioeconomic group gets savaged by Tom Wolfe in the book. And that was the idea of the movie. Brian De Palma, fresh off of, he had done, of course, Scarface, and he did The Untouchables, and Casualties of War, a phenomenal film, but bombed at the box office. So Bonfire of the Vanities was supposed to be a big comeback for De Palma. And that movie also scored in the 30s on Rotten Tomatoes, and most people who loved the book didn't really like it, and that film was a box office disaster and became a kind of cautionary tale. Just because you have a great literary property, if you don't cast it correctly, you're fucked. And every single person in that film, with maybe the exception of F. Murray Abraham and Saul Rubinek, everyone else is miscast. Morgan Freeman as a Jewish judge from the Bronx, named Myron Kavitsky. What are we doing here? Bruce Willis's character was supposed to be British. Why was he cast? The character of Sherman McCoy that Tom Hanks plays was supposed to be a waspy guy a la William Hurt. Why did we cast Tom Hanks? And Melanie Griffith was miscast as the mistress. Well, actually, you could say that Kim Cattrall as Sherman McCoy, the Tom's character's wife, she was okay. That casting of her made sense. But that was a disaster, and Tom Hanks kind of went away for a while. He didn't really come back until A League of Their Own in the summer of 92. Well, Clint Eastwood had a get-out-of-jail-free card that no one knew about. As I say, in the pre-internet era, very few people knew that he'd had a screenplay sitting on his shelf for either 10 or 15 years, depending on who's telling the story, called The William Money Killings. And when the dust had settled after the box office disaster of The Rookie, Clint approached the executives at Warner Brothers, many of whom he considered friends. Again, he had made so much money for the studio and would make a lot more going forward from here. So he presented this project. Look, boys, I know that we didn't hit the mark with The Rookie. I really thought that the pairing of Charlie and me, whatever he said to him, because I actually think that he and Charlie Sheen had good chemistry. And unfortunately, Charlie Sheen was going through some really, really tough shit at that particular point in his career with substance abuse problems. And, there were reports of problems on the set. And Clint, to his credit, tried so hard to keep Charlie, focused and working. And I don't think there's anything wrong with Charlie Sheen's performance in The Rookie. The movie's just not good. And the character that Clint plays is the least interesting of any of the cop characters that he played in the various films, not just Dirty Harry, but, movies like The Gauntlet. It's just not good. So Clint approached the Warner executives sometime in early 1991 with The William Money Killings. And the screenplay had been written by David Webb Peoples, who also got script credit for Blade Runner. And the executives really liked the script. And when Clint said, listen, I think I can get Gene, meaning Hackman, I got a line, I've been talking to Sir Richard Harris, and I got some ideas here, and I think we can make this look like an expensive film, but I don't think it's going to cost more than, 10 to 15 million. They went for it. They didn't even hesitate, because Gene Hackman, oddly enough, at that point in time, he was closer to the A-list than Clint. Because of these failures, Clint suddenly was way down on the mountain. So the Warner Brothers executives, agreeing to all of what Clint was telling them about what would later be retitled Unforgiven, he was able to make Unforgiven completely unimpeded. It was mostly shot in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. It was not shot in the American West. A little bit of a twist on the Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns, which were called that not because the consistency of the films were like spaghetti, but because they were shot in Italy and funded with Italian money, hence the title Spaghetti Westerns. Well, Unforgiven was shot mostly in Calgary. Clint got the best possible cast he could together, including the aforementioned, it's funny, Saul Rubinek, he's one of the best things about the Bonfire of the Vanities movie, but he's also phenomenal as a writer, a book author in Unforgiven. So Clint was able to make Unforgiven, and he finished the film, and he screened it for the Warner executives probably about a year after the conversations that I was just saying, when the failure of The Rookie was assured, and Clint was, almost coming with his hat in his hand to the executives, can I, are you guys give me the go-ahead to do this movie? So sometime in February of 1992, 14 months after the failure of The Rookie, Clint screened Unforgiven for the Warner Brothers executives, who hit the proverbial ceiling at the offices, and suddenly word leaked out that what? Clint Eastwood is about to make the comeback that nobody saw coming when we were throwing dirt on his days on the A-list, leading man, etc., etc. But he is not only making a comeback, this film will not only be a significant box office hit, but this will be an Oscar contender, mark our words. And these were the kinds of stories that were well sourced. Nobody put a name to it, again, in Daily Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. But these stories that were coming out about this screening, they were sourced, they were credible, and ultimately, it's exactly what happened. Unforgiven came out August 7th, cleaned up at the box office for a pretty, not like a rah-rah Western in the manner of the next year's, of course, Tombstone with Val, but Unforgiven was an enormous box office hit. It got mostly rapturous praise from critics. But before that, Clint got In the Line of Fire, a movie where he was merely a hired gun. He just acted in The Line of Fire. After being told by a Castle Rock executive, Eastwood's agent put Clint up for the lead role of Frank Horrigan, supposed to be a 60-ish Secret Service agent who was a rookie agent the day that Kennedy was assassinated, and his inaction led Kennedy to getting shot and killed in the world of that film. the Castle Rock executive who famously said to Clint Eastwood's agent, "We're not in the Clint Eastwood business anymore." Well, suddenly, all of Hollywood, when Unforgiven screened and everyone knew this is going to be the next big thing, all of a sudden everybody, once again, was in the Clint Eastwood business, including Warner Brothers, who, since giving him the green light to make Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood has won Warner Brothers 4 Academy Awards, 2 for Best Picture, 2 for Best Director, and his films have made hundreds of millions for that studio. But he had to bottom out. Again, bottom out within the parameters of Hollywood. Eastwood's life wasn't in jeopardy. He just had movies that failed. He was still worth however many tens of millions of dollars. But he needed to, I guess, accept that this style of film wasn't going to work, and he had to continue to evolve, as he had been talking about trying to have the strong female roles in his movies in the manner of James Cameron. You think about the Aliens and Terminator 2 and Avatar even, what James Cameron's always tried to do with his works. And that Clint Eastwood strove to do the same kind of thing, these sort of powerful second lead, adjacent to the hero female character. I mean, Rene Russo in The Line of Fire, although Clint didn't direct it, that's the kind of character we're talking about, where she's every bit as good an agent, if not better, than Clint Eastwood's Frank Horrigan. But on this day, 1990, well, yesterday, in 1990, the last film of what you could call the first phase of Clint Eastwood's stupendous movie career came to a halt with the release, critical thrashing, and box office failure of The Rookie. But the irony of the man from Malpaso, with all of the success he had had into his age 60 year, the best was yet to come. This has been episode 640 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your freezing Monday evening here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.